One of the most important things that happened with modernization and industrialization and urbanization was a challenging of traditional gender roles and an emergence of a new wave of feminism. There was the feminism that emerged around suffrage in the 19th century, but it still was very much of a countercultural movement. Whereas this became something that's going to end up with the 19th Amendment and women getting the right to vote, but also just playing a larger role in society more generally, and being more active in the ways that they could express their own identity. And that's a very important piece of this period. There was something called the New Woman. Like the New Negro for African Americans, the New Negro was educated, self-possessed, in opposition to the older version of blackness, which was the sharecropper, uneducated agricultural worker. And so the new woman is going to be the same thing: self-possessed, highly educated, and will redefine gender in many ways. So if we look at where we are today, obviously, when you think about where gender divisions are today, it's become so complicated because women define themselves in so many different ways, whether as athletes or professionals. The sexuality obviously has become much more complicated, gender queerness, and there are various ways that women express their femininity, and what femininity means has been changed enormously, even in the last 10 years. So the question is there such a thing as womanhood anymore? Even to talk about that quality, I mean, perhaps we've even moved beyond the binary of male and female. And so obviously from this standpoint, going back to some of these earlier periods, it looks a little bit regressive and kind of oversimplified, which of course it was. So if you look at modern feminism, feminism broadly speaking, the appeal for women's rights, particularly by women, was always criticized. If you look at Nobody Loves Me, Guess I'll Be a Suffragette, suffragettes were often perceived as being kind of killjoys and women who couldn't find husbands, and that were attacking the traditional social order because they didn't fit in it. And again, this sort of anti-feminist cartoon on the right, this idea that, feminists are really women that don't fit into the traditional gender roles, and therefore, there's something wrong with them. And there's always been a little bit of an element of this all the way through, that there's something wrong with a feminist because they don't quite fit in some ways into the traditional values. So if you look at where we were under Trump, a lot of people didn't vote for Hillary. A lot of Trump voters didn't vote for Hillary because they disagreed with the fact that she had abandoned a lot of traditional ideas of what womanhood was, and she did so for very good reason, and that she didn't want to play second fiddle to her husband. She in herself was a very accomplished politician, academic, professional. And for her, motherhood wasn't the most important thing. It was one part of her identity, not all of it. And she was rejected for that. A lot of women, when they were polled on this, both suburban women and rural women said, we support a more traditional idea of what gender is. And so again, the woman in the home, the woman as a mother, this still has a very strong hold on a significant portion of our population. So we've got different views of how women should be in society. So let's go back to the 19th century. In the 19th century, there was this idea of the cult of domesticity, which meant that men's area of influence was in the public sphere, and women's area of influence was in the private sphere, which meant in the home. And so they were actually seen as superior. Men were seen as superior in intelligence and ability to be proactive in government and stuff like that. But women were more pious. They were morally superior. They were more pure. And of course, that's a double-edged sword, because that purity speaks to, they're sexually chaste. The whole idea of women's sexual pleasure wasn't really a thing. It was more of this purity idea was that, women were sexual for the purpose of having children, and that was about it. There was this elevation of motherhood as this sort of sacred duty, and they protected the religious and the values and the values of the country. So this whole idea of separation of spheres, which trapped women in this particular way of thinking about things, but it also gave them power. It gave them power particularly in the domestic sphere. Now, as women begin to enter into the public sphere a little bit more, there's this whole idea that the female sensibility, I put this in quotation marks, right? There was a sort of delicate nature of the woman, and she had to be, treated carefully and, prone towards, emotional imbalance, all of these sorts of stereotypes. This begins really where in the late 19th century, this starts. So what's interesting is women, of course, rejected this idea. This was primarily a male projected sensibility. And as women begin to go into work, particularly working class women, their physical toughness and their wanting to get education, and women leaving the private sphere is going to challenge the separation of sphere. Now, by the turn of the century, you get to this new woman. The new woman, as the picture on the left suggests, is curvy, right? Big bust, big waist, narrow hips. This is sort of the prototype, if you think about it, for the Barbie doll. And the criticisms that women had about beauty standards, so unreasonable ones. So this would usually involve a corset, really tying your waist so it was very thin, creating this kind of hourglass figure. And this was accompanied by the idea that the new woman, she just didn't look a certain way. She also was politically active. So she was a little bit more aggressive. She was in the public sphere. She was educated, usually an advanced education. She had an assertiveness. And at the same time, it's interesting, while it's saying that she's a suffragette, the other way of the Gibson girl, which was more the advertising version of this, was, took away her political side. She was portrayed as being affluent, athletic, sexually autonomous, but not promiscuous. So what's interesting is it begins with a kind of, literally, the Gibson girl was an advertising. So it came from advertising, and the new woman actually came from what women were actually doing. So what's interesting is that the advertising culture begins to adopt the larger idea of what a woman is going to be. Now, what's interesting as this begins to happen is that as women enter into the public sphere, all of a sudden there's a lot more focus on the hysterical woman, which was seen as a kind of a failure of the nervous system for women, and that they were kind of subject to these outbursts of emotional behavior. And I mean, this literally women ended up in insane asylums and imprisoned, and in some cases, completely isolated because of this, which was basically interestingly diagnosed primarily by male doctors, and gave all sorts of different quack medical solutions to this. So what's interesting is while women were becoming more emotionally dysregulated, well, so were men. And this was more a byproduct of being in the modern world. So neurasthenia, which was a commonly not prescribed, what's the word? Diagnosed, diagnosis basically, came as men were experiencing nervous breakdowns, right? Depression, anxiety, which came from a loss of nervous energy. And what's fascinating is most of the people that experienced this were, very competitive businessmen or very accomplished people, but they were men, right? And they were successful and they were WASPs. So ironically, the argument was made, well, it's because these people have superior nervous systems, right? They're so highly tuned that like a racehorse, right? It's just they get these bouts of neurasthenia, and so for men, of course, having neurasthenia was a sign of actually status, whereas for women it was hysteria, which is basically this. It was the same. Effectively, they were presenting with the same symptoms, but for women they were hysteria and emotionally dysregulated, and for men they were sort of experiencing this byproduct of their perfect nervous systems. It's ridiculous. And it is interesting, again, the use of vibrators for women, right, which was used for massage, a way to settle yourself down. In some cases, it was actually used to stimulate orgasms in women to get them to overcome their hysteria, which, again, there's a lot to be said about that, but I'm not going to go too much into that. Now, what's interesting is the Gibson girl, if you remember this slide, right, this idea of the independent woman actually was modeled in part on Alice Roosevelt. So Alice Roosevelt, if you look at the Gibson girl, there's a strong resemblance, both in her figure and her face. So again, highly, very high social class. But Alice Roosevelt was a spunky young woman. I mean, she was out there like her dad. She drank publicly. She smoked cigarettes. She put tacks down underneath the seats of men that she didn't like very much. She jumped into a swimming pool on a cruise to Japan, fully clothed, and asked other members of Congress to jump in with her and mess around, not sexually, but just to have fun. And she was sort of seen as sort of risque. It's this new femininity. So she did challenge her father's authority, and she challenged the whole idea of womanhood. So this is more the new woman and the Gibson girl coming together into this new form of the more assertive woman. Now, the other thing that happens here is that women get more involved both in social reform movements. So the women's social clubs, these were groups of upper middle class women, educated women, who were trying to deal with everything from public health to improving schools. They were sort of like the early PTA, if you will. And they were literary groups that were advocating for suffrage. So these were both social reform and political reform movements by groups of women who are getting together to form political advocacy groups. Same thing happened with working class women. Working class women began to form unions, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, for those of you that remember the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire back from sophomore year. That happened in 1911. They were working on hours, wages, and working conditions, and helping the conditions for women. And it's interesting, this whole idea of they used, actually, one of the arguments they used is that women, because of pregnancy and because of other specifically female physiology, that they shouldn't work as many hours. And of course that argument, arguing from female weakness, came back to haunt them. In this case, the Muller versus Oregon case, this was about laundry workers wanting shorter hours. And the Brandeis brief basically said, women's special physical organization, right? Women are more prone to be sick, and overwork impacted childbirth and female functions. So somehow working women too hard, it was arguing from female weakness, which was the reason that hours were cut for women. Of course, that helped them as far as the work-family balance, but left them with this tricky situation. At the same time all this is going on, middle class and upper middle class women, like we saw with men, begin to form their own separate colleges. And this is understandable because this is the gateway to professional advancement. And of course, there was still segregation. So most of these women are going into careers in teaching and nursing and social work, all seen as acceptable to women because the only people really who should be teaching children should be women, because it was more of a maternal role. No self-respecting man would ever get caught dead teaching. Nursing was the same way. It served the caretaking role of women, and social work was an extension of the domestic sphere into the public sphere. So what you start seeing is the establishment of women in education, the establishment of women in public areas, in political platforms and suffrage movements. And here we go. We have the emergence of a new, more assertive